EastWest Quantum Leap Symphonic Orchestra Orchestration for Metal tutorial. That's a catchy title there. From now on, for ease, I'm going to refer to the EastWest product as Quantum Leap because that's one hell of a mouthful. What this tutorial is going to be teaching you is how to prepare and mix good MIDI orchestration for use with metal music in particular. Now, you may wonder why we need to make that distinction. The reason is that orchestras are mixed and recorded and mastered in very different ways to most modern music, and so there's a real trade-off to be made when you're combining something like an orchestra with something like metal. There's all sorts of frequency clashes, and there's all sorts of differences in the way that they sound good when they're mixed, so you've really got to balance all of that, and often it's the orchestra that loses out, which really, if you're a metal band, that's rightly so, because the metal has to take the priority. But when you start doing that, you start making the orchestra sound very unrealistic, so there's plenty of stuff to talk about to make sure you're getting the most out of that side of things. Now, I'm using Quantum Leap, which is, I'm probably right in saying, is right up there with the best that is possible to get at the moment. It's fairly old. It's coming on for, I think, 7 or 8 years old now, which is a great thing because there's not much out there that's better, and it's dropped in price quite significantly. It's not cheap at all, but do keep an eye on their website. I'll put it on the screen because it's not what you'd expect. It's soundsonline.co.uk. They regularly have sales. I think they've come to the point where, because it's 7 or 8 years old, they've come to the point where they've made all their big money sales, and now they're just trying to knock it out the door as much as they can, and so they reduce the price quite regularly with some really good sales. So keep an eye out for that if you are looking to upgrade. If you've got something cheaper, I used to use Garritan Personal Orchestra. That's actually amazing quality for the money. It cost me, I think, £60 in about 2006. I still think it's under £100 now, the latest version, and it's absolutely brilliant. There's a link on screen now to a song I recorded using that, and I've now actually re-rendered that using Quantum Leap. I'll put a link to that on screen as well, so you can see the difference between the two. Now, this is going to be a 3-part tutorial. Part 1, I'm going to talk about how to set up an orchestra for metal in different ways from how you would set up a traditional orchestra, and how you're going to set up Qbase as well to handle that. Part 2 is going to cover realistic MIDI expression and programming. And part 3 is going to talk about the final mixing and mastering stage, what plugins you should be using for your orchestra instruments. Okay, the first thing we're going to cover is the ways the orchestra you set up is going to differ from the way a traditional orchestra is set up. If I bring up this graphic here for us to see, this is an open source Wikipedia Commons picture, so you can find this free anywhere online. The license information is below in the description. You'll see that an orchestra, I mean, this has been designed by some extremely talented people, many people over hundreds of years. It's something you can't really mess with. The instruments have all been chosen to fit together very well, and if you see an orchestra live, you'll understand that it sort of mixes itself. That's a common term used for an orchestra. The players and the instruments work together so well that it really does sound amazing. Now, some problems for the modern mixer. As you can see, a lot of the instruments, a lot of the main ones, the violins, violas, all the woodwinds and some of the brass all go down the middle in the centre. And the 3D effect of the orchestra is really front to back rather than out to the sides so much. One big problem, see I highlight here, is that the bass is over to one side largely. The tubas, contrabasses and double bass and the bass drum. Now, if you were to mix that in with most modern music, which has the bass running down the centre, you're going to have a real offset in your mix, and it's not going to sound very good. So we've got one problem here already. We're going to have to shift around where the bass instruments go. The other major problem is the percussion will be off to the left, and then the snares are over on the right. So this, again, is very unusual. On a modern song of most genres, pretty much any genre, you're going to have almost all the percussion down the centre. Certainly the kick drum and the snare. Maybe the toms will be stereoed a bit. The cymbals might be stereoed around the field. By and large, this is not what we're going to want. You certainly don't want your snare occurring off at one side when something really low like timpanis are going to be occurring down on the left. That's going to, again, cause you some problems. So once we start moving these around, we then have to rebalance the rest of the orchestra, and you need this understanding of how the instruments are working together so that you don't end up making a complete hash of it. Okay, so swapping this over to a stereo map, of how I interpret my orchestra for the stereo space that we work with modern music. This is the way I set it up for my Songwriter in Ladris, the link that was shown earlier, and I'll put down in the description. See the rearrangement, the percussion is very central. Now with Quantum Leap and also with Garritan, and I would imagine with others as well, a lot of the percussion is filling out the stereo space and you don't have much control of it. Like if you listen to the cymbals, some may be panned a bit left, some a bit right, some central. I'm not too worried about that, which is why I've spread the percussion over the central bit there. And also the timpanis often will go from low to high, maybe slightly left to slightly right to give it a bit of stereo space. That's fine, not too concerned with that, as long as you've got it so that it's pretty central. The important things with a traditional orchestra when we're trying to rearrange the instruments is making sure that we're balancing the tones and the octave spaces properly. Now you can see the contrabass, which is like a really low cello, I've put right down the middle, which is where we need it for modern music, so it can sit well with our bass guitar and kick and any other bass that's occurring. The cellos then appear either side. The reason I've got them both sides is the cellos, I use them a lot. They're probably my main stringed instrument. And I wanted them to be filling out the sound, but also not to be imbalanced on one side or the other if I'm using them a lot. So I use the stereo function in Quantum Leap to create it slightly out on either side, maybe about 10 or 20% out on either side. On the left, then further out at about 50%, I've got my viola. And I've balanced that on the right about 60% with the violin and the clarinet. They tend to occupy similar octave ranges as the viola. The violin goes a lot higher. I'll be coming on to that again soon. Further out than that, we've got the flute and the oboe, which I tend to use in the same octave spaces, so they are quite high wind instruments, and again further out. The harp is incidental, it goes there just to fill out some space. I don't use it very often, so it's just a little interest to the ear occasionally over there. That type of thing you can move around. But to show you how these octaves work properly, you'll see, so the 0 octave mark where I start my bass down the middle. And as you can see, it's balanced on either side so that whenever things are playing, there's not too much mismatch in the way the bass and the treble sounds are working. And at the same time, I've tried to balance the type of tones of the instruments as well. So the violin and the viola will both fill out the same thing at the same time and sound pretty good together. The flute and the oboe, both woodwinds. I don't use much brass, but if you were to add brass in, then this would be a fairly good place to put them. You'd want your tuba down the middle because it's very low to fit with the other bass. Trumpets are pretty high. Now I've mixed them with the viola because the viola would be going at maybe octave 2 and your trumpets would be up at octave 3, so that they're melding well together. You wouldn't want them competing in the same octave. Same over on the right hand side, the trombones would be a bit lower and the low French horns would be maybe octave 2, and the violins would be taking the space the octave above, so again they're not clashing. So that's a really good way to maybe spread your tonal range and octave spread. This is by no means concrete set in stone. You may not want to use some of these instruments, or you may like to use other orchestral instruments. There are quite a few others to choose from. This is just an illustration for you to understand how you want to maybe balance the sound so that it fills the stereo field without being imbalanced, without anything clashing too much. So once you've decided how you want your orchestra set up, I'm just going to run through how to set Qbase up properly with Quantum Leap so that you have the maximum control over the instruments you've decided to use. The example I'm going to use is a string quartet. You can see I've created 4 MIDI channels: contrabass, cello, viola, violin. We go into Quantum Leap here, go into the browser, you can see them here. We've got the contrabass, cello, viola, and violin. Now these numbers in brackets next to them are the MIDI channels that I've assigned to each one. There is a triangle here, I'll come on to this later, it is there for a reason. 1, 2, 3, and 4, this has been chosen down here in this MIDI channel option here. Over in Qbase, I have the option of the MIDI channel here, number 1, cello, I've set 2, viola 3, so on, so that they match. So I can write the MIDI for each one, controls each one individually. Now, what some people don't realise is, as well as the MIDI option, we have an output option here. And you'll see they're all set to 1 and 2. I'm going to keep the contrabass on 1 and 2. What I'm going to do is move the cello to 3 and 4, the viola to 5 and 6, and the violin to 7 and 8. So that means I'll now be able to control them individually, add any effects I want to individually. Now in Qbase, we bring up the VST instrument panel here, and there's an activate outputs button here, as you can see. And you'll see 1 and 2 is selected, 9 and 10, again I'm going to come on to, but I'm going to activate 3 and 4, 6 and 7 and 8. And as you can see, they now appear down here. I'm going to rename them. And then if I bring my mix console over here, there they are, the contrabass, cello, viola, violin. They are available for me to work with individually, put some inserts in and change the faders here, so it gives an extra layer of control. One final thing to show you is the reverb function. We go into something like the contrabass. Over here is a reverb option, and there's a lot to choose from. See some really good quality ones as well, so worth taking your time to look through and choose the ones that you want. I like to go for ones that have a fairly quiet low end, because that tends to muddy things up a bit. So I like to pick ones that have a really sparkly high end reverb and not too much on the low end. However, you can choose these individually for each instrument, but what you can also do, if I bring up the triangle, you'll see this has now got the master reverb turned on. Now I'm not using a triangle at all in the music, but what happens is when you turn master on this channel, is all the reverb from the other instruments gets routed through this track. And that's really handy, because you can then, rather than have reverb on each individual track, you can have it on its own track like an auxiliary fader, and just dial in as much reverb as you want for each instrument. To show you quickly in the browser, under the triangle, I created that on output 9 and 10 on its own. And if I now go to something like the contrabass, move the mixer over so that we can see something. We can see the reverb track here. We can see the contrabass here. If I play the that's the cello. If I play the contrabass, you can see the reverb comes in over here. So I can reduce that down if I wanted to, or you have a lot more control over it basically than if it's on the actual contrabass track. Bring this back over here just to make sure this is understood fully. If we look at something like the contrabass, you need to turn the reverb on, but by creating another track, like a triangle track, and turning on the master, the reverb doesn't appear on the contrabass track, it appears on the triangle track instead, as does all of these other reverbs. So you're separating the reverb out by using this master, putting it on something you're not using, creating a track for it, and then you only get reverb on there, and you have much more control over the volume of it. So really handy trick to use there. Finally, I have the platinum version of Quantum Leap. If you have, I think, normal gold version, you may only get the stage mic. With platinum, you get a close mic as well, which is like having a microphone on the instrument, so you can blend the stage sound with the close sound. That's really nice to be able to do. The stage sound is naturally panned as to where the instrument sits in the orchestra. The close mic is panned centrally, so as you can see, I've adjusted that a bit. Over on the output here, this output is purely for the instrument you're working with, not for the whole program. So you can mess with this fader and then go on to another instrument and it will be back up where it was. So you don't need to set this for a master fader, it is per track. So again, you have another layer of control there. That concludes this particular episode. Episode 2, there's going to be a lot more demonstration of sounds and stuff, because we're going to be talking about how to realistically program this so that it does sound realistic. Basically, there's a lot to it, and because it's so expensive, you really need to know it well to get the most out of it. So hopefully you'll join me for that. I hope this has been of some help. Cheers.